Hello and welcome to this special holiday, Christmas, New Year's edition of The President's Path. We've kind of got our Christmas jumpers and Christmas ties on. It's the first part of a two-part show where we're going to walk back, not everything because we won't fit that in, but as much as we can of President Trump's administration in 2025. We've got the gang back together. Me and Sumi and Bernd are here, and Courtney is joining us from her new beat in the White House for Bloomberg. There's no way we'll recap everything. It's going to be a whirlwind, so do stay with us for that. Let's kick things off because it got quite dramatic pretty quickly right on Inauguration Day. Bernd, you were there.
I was, yeah, and I think the most memorable thing to me was just how quickly everything changed. Right as the clock hit noon that day, there was a big truck, and you could see them bringing in all the new decorations. And I think on the third or fourth day of the administration, I went into the Oval, and President Trump answered questions on all sorts of stuff for about half an hour, which I think really kind of set the tone for the year in terms of how much we actually hear from him directly, because it certainly wasn't like that, the last 2 years of the Biden White House in which I was there. But the changes weren't all just cosmetic. On that first day alone, he signed 26 executive orders. And there was dozens by the end of that first week. Most of them were really aimed at a kind of undoing essentially everything that Biden had done, whether it be about climate or immigration, and also kind of like at least moving towards fulfilling rather some of the campaign promises he made. I think the immigration ones that we saw on the first day, and which immediately militarized the border and rolled back a lot of the Biden era immigration controls. I mean, that all went out the day in the you know out the window in the first few days. And then, there was obviously some unexpected things that happened that month as well. There was the wildfires in California, and notably the plane crash in here in Washington. And that was the first time, and one of very few times, that President Trump has actually come into the briefing room. And I think most people will remember that he instantly, without providing any evidence whatsoever, blamed diversity initiatives at the FAA for what had happened, which we now know was, there was also a series of failures, some of which had nothing to do with the FAA, military failures that led to that collision. But I think that also set the tone for the year, and that, we saw that he was often willing to kind of blame policies or political opponents for an issue before the full picture was even formed. That press conference at the briefing room after the plane crash, that was maybe 6 hours after the plane crash, maybe eight. I mean, it was kind of midday, and that plane crash was very early in the morning. So I think that was perhaps the most memorable moment of January, and it was the first really kind of unexpected event that the White House had to kind of pivot and deal with, in addition to the wildfires.
The few things there that really stand out to me as well, Bernie, is on those pardons on the first day. I remember leading up to the inauguration, we were talking about what Trump would do, what the president would do with January 6th and with the J6ers, as they're called, those who, many of whom have faced convictions or faced charges relating to the January 6th, 2021 attack on the Capitol. And the fact that there was a blanket pardon issued across the board for those J6ers took even, many observers, Republican observers, by surprise. So that was one that really stood out to me. And again, Bernie, that access. I mean, all of us were glued to the television, weren't we, thinking, oh my gosh, the president, 3 hours in the Oval Office. What is he going to say? What questions do we get in? It was a completely different environment.
It's interesting that you say in January about, those few days in, we suddenly saw a very different interaction between the media and the president. For me, if we move on to February, that month was really marked even more so by that. I mean, early on in February, we had that press conference with Elon Musk in the Oval Office with one of his children on his shoulders. President Trump sort of looking up admirably at him as Elon Musk laid out his plans for DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, not a department, not an agency, more of a kind of a group or a concept, and how he was planning to dismantle. I mean, the budget at one point was to do $2 trillion of cuts to federal spending. Then it became $1 trillion By the time Elon Musk left, it was more in the realm of 170 billion or so. But nevertheless, as we're talking here, he has reduced the federal workforce by about 300,000 people, about 1 in 8 workers. But that press conference, he took so many questions, speaking far more than the president did. That bookended the beginning of February. If you move to the end of February, then we had what for me was probably one of the most remarkable moments of the year, which was that President Zelensky visit to the White House. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in all my years of covering American presidents or politics anywhere else for that matter. There had been a stream of world leaders in to visit the new President Trump on his second term. We'd seen Prime Minister Netanyahu come in just the day before. We'd seen the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, come in. And then here was the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky coming to speak to President Trump, who had promised to so quickly solve, of course, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. President Zelensky coming, nominally at least, to ink a deal that would give the US access to rare earths, a minerals deal in Ukraine. The media was allowed in for all of this exchange between the leaders, which was something that we hadn't seen before. And all of a sudden, it took quite a turn southwards when someone asked President Trump a question about kind of where his alliances lay. Were they with Russia? Were they with Ukraine? Whomever. And then J.D. Vance stepped in to defend the president and said this was all diplomacy. And then President Zelensky gave a forceful defense of himself, saying you can't talk about diplomacy with Russia. They've broken deals in the past. They've invaded my country. They've killed my people. Then we had raised voices. We had J.D. Vance, the vice president, so famously saying, have you ever even said thank you? You should have a few words of appreciation for the United States, which of course has spurned so many internet memes, hasn't it, about saying thank you and so on. And, you know, I always wonder, is this how leaders talk in private when they're trying to do diplomacy and hammer deals out? And suddenly we were all there for the world to see. I was at the White House that day. Eventually the media were ushered out of the Oval Office and we were waiting for a scheduled press conference. And I was standing outside live on air. I will never forget this moment saying, hang on, President Zelensky's motorcade is pulling up to the door. He's not supposed to be leaving for another hour and a half. And then moments later, he and his team came out and they left without signing that deal, without holding that press conference. And suddenly the whole situation was thrown into turmoil as to where did President Trump stand when it came to Ukraine, when it came to Russia, when it came to European allies. I mean, some of these questions we're still asking ourselves at the end of the year.
I think probably more than any other moment of the year, that just kind of highlighted that whatever norms had existed in terms of, the White House coming from the diplomacy were completely gone. I think now, especially after that moment, most leaders have a recognition that anything they say behind closed doors might not necessarily be behind closed doors, and they might be going for the purpose of meeting about one thing, and then the meeting does a 180-degree turn and turns into something completely different. I mean, we saw that later in the year with Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa as well. I think there's a recognition that you have to go in and kind of expect the unexpected, or maybe expect a surprise if there's some underlying tension.
I have since spoken to, diplomats before meetings in the Oval Office, asking for advice on how to handle Donald Trump, because that, I think, was, as you said, Bern, a very defining moment for this administration and how they handle diplomacy and foreign policy. March was also a bombshell month for this administration when we saw them face one of their first real crises when it came to the president's cabinet. The then National Security Advisor, Mike Walls, accidentally added the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic to a text chat he was on the app Signal with the Secretary of Defense, the Director of Intelligence, the CIA Director, and others. And on that chat, the Secretary of Defense was sharing precise targets and plans for strikes on Yemen. This came out in an Atlantic piece by the editor-in-chief and raised a whole bunch of concerns about whether this had jeopardized the plans, military operations, and people's lives. The Secretary of Defense, of course, said that no classified information had been shared. And it did launch an Inspector General report, which we just got the results of this month, that cleared him, but said he did, in fact, put people's lives in danger by sharing this information if it had gotten into the wrong hands. So that was a big story, explosive story. We weren't sure if Secretary Hegseth would survive it. Mike Walls, of course, did resign as the National Security Advisor and has since was appointed to ambassador to the UN. But it was the first time we saw the president deal with a major crisis when it came to his administration, which of course was something that we saw mark his first administration regularly in terms of turnover and scandal. The other major thing in March that stood out to me was the ramp up of this administration's immigration policies, and specifically the raids on workplaces, on construction sites. We really saw them with an aggressive pursuit of detaining and deporting immigrants, both legal and illegal. And the case that really kicked off the most resistance and protest to this administration was the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was detained while driving with his 5-year-old son in Baltimore and incorrectly deported to El Salvador, where he was held in a prison that the administration was using and sending, folks that they had been deporting to. This, of course, was a long saga that has played out over the entire year. The Supreme Court ruled that he had to be returned. He, of course, was. And he's been in and out of court. Most recently, he was released while his appeal against his deportation takes place. And so that case, I think, was also defining when it came to the administration's immigration policies.
Yeah, as you said, Courtney, that really, I think, opened our eyes as to how the administration was going to pursue its immigration policy. And Kilmar Abrego Garcia became a rallying cry for the Democrats as well. As you said, we're still talking about it. But immigration was the one side of President Trump's, central pillar of his agenda. The other was the economy, tariffs. We know he loves tariffs. He talked about this on the campaign trail, and then came Liberation Day. How can you forget it at the White House? That massive poster board with the table of the countries and the reciprocal tariff rate they were facing. I actually remember, Bernie, I wasn't at the White House that day, but you actually sent pictures of those poster boards, small versions of them, being handed out to the reporters who were there covering the event. And it was amazing to see just how the administration went line by line to look at each country and each trading partner. So you had the 10% base rate. There were, of course, sector-specific tariffs. So if you think of steel and aluminum, 25% on those imports. But then you had rates of 60% for Cambodia, Vietnam, for example. The European Union facing a 20% tariff. And it set allies and adversaries alike absolutely scrambling, because this was seen as kind of a jumping off point for negotiations to try to bring those rates down by reaching a trade agreement with President Trump, with his administration. And it was remarkable to me that, you saw a massive market reaction, didn't you, right after those tariffs were announced. And just about a week later, the administration announced this 90-day pause on many of those reciprocal tariffs while trade agreements were being negotiated. And that was, in a way, a reflection of understanding that the markets hadn't been particularly happy about some of these tariff rates. But that day, Liberation Day, really has defined the tariff agenda this entire year. And all of these trade agreements that we've been discussing through the course of the year, they all kind of pin back to that day. That was the jumping off point for how the president has approached those trade negotiations. And, if he uses the economic threat of a tariff, he often returns to the rate that was set on that Liberation Day, a reciprocal tariff rate. The other part of April that I think really stood out to me was actually, we were talking about President Zelensky and that bombshell meeting in the White House. Well, when President Trump went to Pope Francis's funeral with the First Lady Melania in the Vatican, you saw that remarkable image just 2 months after that meeting in the White House of these two men in St. Peter's Basilica. I mean, the surroundings, of course, iconic and incredibly beautiful, alone, huddled together, seated. And there was such a change of body language in that photo after that really toxic meeting in the White House that it also shifted our perception of where negotiations on Ukraine and Russia might go. Now, that's shifted several times since then, as we know, we've gone back and forth. But that really stood out to me because, it was a sign that there was a coming back from that moment, a repairing of the relationship that was possible.
The thing for me about that image as well was how Trump likes to deal leader to leader. Like, what was interesting there was the Oval Office, there'd been two big entourages. Here they were head to head, almost whispering in each other's ears about what happens next. But it really showed us as well, President Trump, for everything he'd said on the campaign trail and indeed at his inaugural address about wanting to be America first and kind of not so concerned about what happened on other countries' borders. Here you have, between Liberation Day and all the effort with Ukraine and Russia, about actually an America that is world facing, that is global facing, and that is looking at every other country in the world and what level of threat it poses to the US economy.
May actually was a nice transition into what we saw in April, in that it had a heavy focus on foreign policy. We saw the president make a very high-profile visit. He traveled across Saudi Arabia, he went to Qatar, he went to the UAE, and he really set out to transform the U.S. relationship with the region. And I think this trip truly underscored just how much an economic forward approach this administration has taken. The whole trip, we saw a star-studded spectacle. There was lots of U.S. CEOs there. Elon Musk made an appearance. OpenAI's Sam Altman was also there. But, we saw trillions inked in deals with these countries. This region, of course, has played a major role in the Trump administration's pursuit of mediating international conflicts, right? And I think this starts with this visit. He also held the first meeting between a U.S. president and the Syrian president in 25 years. He lifted sanctions, some of which had been in place for 45 years. And he even hinted at a potential deal, a nuclear deal with Iran. So this was a very consequential trip, I think, for the administration. But before the president even left the U.S., there was a lot of concern once we had heard that Qatar had gifted the president a luxury Boeing jet, which is supposed to be used as Air Force One. This is a $400 million gift. U.S. officials, of course, are only supposed to accept gifts that are under $480. And this raised a lot of ethical, legal, and national security concerns, especially whether it broke any foreign influence laws. The White House, of course, said that it was in line with regulations and law. And the U.S. did refit the jet to be used as Air Force One and pledged, it would be donated to Trump's presidential library after he leaves office. But this, again, was another example of how this administration has flouted norms and really, came in with a bang and said, we're going to do things the way we want to do it. And then the final sort of moment in May that really stood out to me was the India-Pakistan conflict, the 4-day conflict that just rocked the world between the two rivals. This was a major point. Everybody was very concerned that it would, explode into a larger conflict that, of course, these countries have been fighting since their foundings. But we did see some intervention by the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UK and UAE as well. And this is also one of the conflicts the president, of course, has taken responsibility for solving. India obviously disagrees, but this is certainly a moment that the administration also sees, where their influence really made a difference.
I think one memorable moment in May for me came at the very end when it was Elon Musk's kind of formal departure from government. He had an event there at the White House, which was, very polite. And Trump said that he always thought that Musk would have some role or, some say in his White House. Which brings us into June, because just a few days into June, we saw the kind of bromance between the two of them really fall apart really quite spectacularly. I mean, obviously there had been some tensions, particularly about the one big beautiful bill, which Musk said was an abomination. But I don't think anyone could have really predicted just how quickly that relationship would unravel and just how ugly it would be. I think, many people remember, Trump said that he had lost his mind, and Elon Musk brought up the Epstein files, and it just seemed to escalate very, very quickly. I remember being at the White House, and among the press corps, at least, it was just almost like a sense of disbelief. Even knowing that there had been disagreements, just how much that would blow up in both their faces, at least for a few days. But then moving forward, I mean, in June, I think it was also very consequential outside of the US domestically, and that we saw active duty Marines deployed to Los Angeles over unrest that was stemmed from immigration protests, which really showed, I think, perhaps more than most things, how differently the president was willing to use executive powers domestically. And of course, that's something, we've seen now here in Washington and Memphis and a few other places. And then there was, of course, which I think is perhaps kind of the standout foreign policy movement of the Trump White House, in that after weeks of back and forth and us not really knowing what was going to happen, we saw US bombers strike Iranian nuclear facilities, which I think the White House very much sees as, one of their primary foreign policy accomplishments. And it also just showed a little bit more of how the president operates, and that, there was kind of ambiguity. Is he going to bomb them? Is he not going to bomb them? Is he going to step in Israel's favor in this 12-day war that's going on between Israel and Iran? And that's something I think we've seen in practice quite a few times since then. I mean, as we're recording this, there's all sorts of debates about what the future holds for US involvement in Venezuela. And we're kind of seeing a bit of that same strategy, in that, he has not been very forthcoming about his long-term plans, as he wasn't about Iran. I mean, in Iran, he had said there was a few more weeks until something happens, and then the bombs started falling, which I thought was really indicative of how he likes to keep people guessing into his intentions.
I suppose the administration would say, though, that they can't telegraph what they're going to do when it comes to foreign policy stuff. But, thinking back to June at this point, it just reminds me of how much has happened this year. In any other year, the US dropping bombs inside Iran, in sovereign territory like that, would just be unthinkable and would be the major event that we'd be talking about for months and months and months.
I completely agree. And I mean, I think it kind of went away quickly. And I think, even most Americans forget that earlier in the year, the US had launched quite substantial military operations against the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, that just seems to have been almost entirely forgotten. I think, just the pace of news in this administration is hard to keep up with.
All right, thank you for joining us today. That's just part one of our end of year in review, looking back month for month at what has happened this year in President Trump's second term in office. Thanks for joining myself and my colleagues here. And do come back next week for part two of The President's Path. We'll look at the rest of the year. Spoiler alert, it's a doozy. There's a lot to talk about.
And we've left loads out, I'm sure, as well. Like, we're just trying to get through a whirlwind spin here.
Yeah, but great to see you all. And we'll see you next week to talk about the second half of the year.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.